Good evening, my dear televiewers. Once again, welcome to our weekly show, My Politics. This is your host, Art Barrett. Our guest this evening is a professor, a corporate global strategist, a doctor, a PhD by a profession, a doctor of philosophy. Friends, help me welcome our guest this evening, Professor Dr. Brian Tu. Good evening, my friend, Dr. Brian, and welcome to my show.
Good evening, Art, and thank you for the opportunity to say hello.
It's a great pleasure. With your hectic schedule and a very short notice, you replied and you responded positively.
The privilege and the pleasure is mine, Art. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Dr. Brian. Professor Brian, you have been a professor for a number of years on leadership and strategy to at least two world famous and well-known universities or institutions. You have the HEC in Paris, founded in 1881, and a senior Wharton Fellow, Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, which was established also in the same year in 1881. Now, as a leadership, as a professor and a strategist on leadership and management as well, okay? So, how do you assess the present leadership of this administration? I mean, when President Duterte assumed office, it was the pre-pandemic and during this extraordinary time of the pandemic.
Well, first of all, thank you. Very few country national leaders would have predicted the challenges that we all face today. Mm-hmm. It goes without saying that almost all countries, a few exceptions, have suffered from this current crisis.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, there are some remote locations, such as Vanuatu, and some of the South Pacific islands that have been spared. But then there are other areas also in the Pacific that are really suffering quite greatly. But thank you for that question. Truly, how do I assess leadership? One of the things for sure that we know is that the pandemic has brought about essentially a lens that we've never experienced before on leadership. Because the question is, how is it that each of these country leaders has managed to manage the crisis? But when you're managing crisis, we're talking about managing the community, managing the community, managing the mental health, the emotional health, and of all of these wonderful countries is different if you were to do comparative analysis. Okay. In some countries you have tremendous leadership. In other countries it's questionable. But it's primarily our concern is the focus on the gaps of leadership, the gaps. And they're quite serious in many areas, such as, not just because I'm very fond of the countries that I'm about to mention, but for example, in India presently, the numbers are critical, they're huge. I mean, you know, the loss of life and the inability to manage healthcare in the country will result in tremendous loss.
Yeah, right. So, during the pre-pandemic, so you mean to say President Duterte apparently managed in a way for meaning for a good of his approach to the problem?
Well, I think it's fair to say that President Duterte, first of all, his leadership style is command and control. That's clearly evidenced by how he assembled his cabinet of secretaries in the first place after he won the election. But as a guest in your country, it's very impolite for me to speak negatively about your leadership. But his approach was, in fact, from my observation, was a command and control, which certainly helped the pandemic and managing the pandemic. Unfortunately, in other parts of the country, specifically in Visayas, it's questionable as to whether or not there has been an absence of leadership or an absolute ignorance of leadership.
I mean to say, Professor Brian is looking from the outside as a guest of this country.
Yes,
okay.
as an
I mean, you
observer.
have an honest to goodness assessment.
Yes, I have no bones to pick. I mean, you know, what we look at is the academic part. It's supposed to be non-biased, impartial, but when we take a look at the results, they vary, and the gaps are huge.
Okay, okay. So what kind of leadership is he adopting, actually? The present administration or President Duterte?
Well, I'm sure many would agree, and perhaps some would disagree, that the leadership style that the president demonstrated in the early part of his administration is different than what it is today. Very, very different.
Okay. You mean to say that the president is exercising or using a benign kind of leadership?
Well, we can think of leadership in two kinds. There's typically a leading style of leadership, and there's something that we call a backup style. The backup style comes from when we're faced with severe conflicts or we're under threat.
Okay.
So foremost, he's very, very strong in terms of the way he engaged drug enforcement and so on and so forth, corruption and so on and so forth. But in recent times, it's safe to say, I think, without too much disagreement, that some of his interests may have shifted.
Yeah, in your own personal opinion, Dr. Brian, what kind of leadership that we are going to adopt in this country, considering that we have already tested a lot of different kinds of leadership from different kinds of leaders in our country?
I think that's fair to say, and certainly the future of the country and its wellness is highly dependent on the leadership of the country. I think that's really the first part. What we can expect in the future, on the eve of the preparations for an election here, which I think, if I'm correct, it's coming soon, like next year.
Okay.
Will depend on the cast of candidates. And if you look at the cast of candidates, declared or undeclared, the ones who are being encouraged or the ones who've already declared varies. I mean, there's a few new faces, but they're essentially all the same faces we're familiar with.
Exactly.
They're the same names.
Yes.
So we pretty well have a good idea.
Yeah, leadership, putting that kind of leadership in managing people and putting a kind of leader in managing a business. How do you reconcile and how do you have it?
Well, I mean, at a very selfish, from a selfish perspective, I would love to see that a corporate leader could transition to public leadership, because managing a country is like very similar to managing an organization, and you've got to be, particularly in the Philippines, you've got to be very concerned about the P&L, the profit and loss, obviously, and so there are some practices that one could question in terms of morality and ethics, but it's not really for me to comment, because this is the way you've operated for so many years.
Okay.
But you can't operate that way in the business sector. I mean, there are some corporate leaders in the Philippines who are truly respected globally. Now, if you take the list of candidates, which you're aware, just as I'm aware, I don't think there's a name more than one or two there who are well respected globally already for their work.
I see. Yeah. Is this the reason why, Dr. Brian, there are a lot of corporate leaders nowadays who are planning or entering into politics?
Wouldn't that be wonderful to see? I mean, because the leadership candidates from the corporate sector would probably less than two hands, who are really, really respected in public administration, but also globally, but also domestically. I mean, I would love to see it, because you are, in essence, managing an enterprise, but it's a very large enterprise. It's a large community. Give or take, we must be talking about close to 110 million citizens and residents, at least. I mean, that's not trivial.
Okay. And how do you assess corporate leaders in this country vis-a-vis with the administration?
Well, there obviously is a clear separation between the corporates and also public administration. I mean, in terms of how do we look at these individuals, I mean, the ones that have track record, unfortunately, many of the candidates that are assembling for this next election don't really have a solid track record. And I believe that you must be prepared. You must have a strategy, you must have platform, and you must be able to have the interests of the country at heart. And that's questionable if you look at the history of the Philippines.
Okay, okay. And Dr. Brian, you're one of the behind-the-scene personalities of the administration. Do you think, you have a lot of, a lot of people who are always having a consultation with the president on leadership?
Well, I'm first of all, I'm very fortunate to be in the position, having practiced for decades in the areas of strategy and leadership. I'm very blessed, very fortunate, and I don't take any of that for granted.
Okay.
But actually, they don't need to listen to me. But they do need to pay attention to what is thought leadership, what are the best practices, what are the strategies that do work. And so when we look at which country leaders seek advice, and when they look at the best practices, many of those best practices are not yet adopted here in the Philippines, not yet. I mean, for example, if you take a look at Malaysia, for example, they have heavy use of third party.
Okay.
People, thought leadership from around the world, the best brains in the world, in fact. If you look at Singapore, even more so, the best brain, they recruit, they attract the best brains in the world. In the Philippines, so far from what I've seen, in 15 years, the time that I've been visiting, give or take, it's more about let's protect ourselves. You know, we don't need to listen to foreigners.
Okay.
But you do need to listen to others. And it's naive not to think that you don't need to listen and pay attention to the best practices.
But are we amenable? I mean, the young leaders, the corporate leaders in this country, with that experience you have?
Well, what happens is the young leaders, the so-called the present generation, who are the emerging leaders of corporates, and they study outside of the country.
Okay.
When you want, respectfully, when they want to learn about how to do things, how to manage people, how to manage projects, they go offshore and learn.
Okay.
They don't stay here because you've got to have diversity in your thinking.
Yeah, Dr. Brian, I learned that you're still continuing your online coaching and online teaching on PhD. So it does also involve leadership and strategy.
Yes, absolutely. Strategy is everything. I mean, essentially we strategize. We either have a strategy or you die. It's as simple as that.
Okay.
And unfortunately, when you're having conversation with leaders, there is no strategy. The strategy is let's do what we did last year.
Okay.
When you ask them to articulate, it's a problem. They're unable to articulate.
I see. How many students you have now?
Well, in the pandemic period, so for the last, I have students globally in PhD programs, probably at least 100 PhD students.
Okay.
But I have the privilege of teaching the military here, Armed Forces Philippines, and I can have as many as 500 to 1,000 students here in the Philippines every year for the last 15 years.
You mean to say the Armed Forces of the Philippines, the personnel?
Yes, it's face to face.
Okay.
And I've in the last 15 years, I've gone out to each of the bases by invitation. I receive no compensation whatsoever, and I teach the Navy, predominantly the Navy, but other branches of the military are always invited. I teach them for a week at a time.
Well, I'll separate the two questions, Professor Dr. Brian, because it's very interesting. Serving and offering yourself for free, pro bono, to our armed forces, and that's a very good and noble program of yours, Professor Dr. Brian, and we'll discuss more with our guest this evening after these reminders. Don't go away. Once again, welcome to our weekly show. This is your host, Art Barit, My Politics. Our guest this evening is a professor on leadership and strategy, a world and a global strategist, a corporate global strategist, Professor Dr. Brian too. Okay, Dr. Brian, very briefly, the Philippines is one of the first countries in Asia to implement stringent health protocols, of course, using the military to prevent the spread of COVID-19 pandemic. But sadly, a CNN report a month or two or so ago reported that we are implementing and addressing the COVID issue in a wrong direction. Okay? But talking on leadership of the present administration, what is your opinion on the issue?
Well, I think it's fair to say that it's inconsistent. The strategy is inconsistent. At the outset, you're correct. With the military's help for enforcement and compliance, and in terms of behavior, the military was very, very helpful.
Okay.
But executing that throughout Visayas and Mindanao, not so easy. And you've got to have the support of governors, the governors of each of the provinces, and the mayors, obviously, to enforce. But there doesn't seem to be a very strong enforcement or consensus as to how. It's inconsistent.
Okay.
So the strategy, in effect, is fragmented. A fragmented strategy won't go very far because you can't sustain it.
Okay, I saw it and I learned that it's not only the country, it's not only the Philippines who is using and mobilizing the military.
Correct.
Likewise, also countries in Europe, they are also doing that. And I just have this notion that, well, this is a health problem. Why is it that we are using the military? But then when I saw on the other wire media, the news report from the outside, they are mobilizing and deploying military. I think, it's more of discipline.
Right, but it's not just discipline. I agree with what you've said. But when we study each of these regions and each of these countries, it has to be more than discipline. Essentially, you can think of the pandemic as having its own ecosystem. An ecosystem meaning you have to have the support of the medical community, the corporate community, of the schools, the hospitals, everybody, particularly the corporates, and even the retailers.
Okay.
And that has to be coordinated, and it's got to have bench strength, meaning that you've got to have enforcement. It's a very strong word, but if you don't have that, you won't have compliance. And of course, the culture of the Philippines is very casual, very wonderful, very supportive, very loving, and sometimes it's difficult to have enforcement in that kind of environment. But yes, there are other countries around. For example, India this week has really stepped up its efforts to control, but they're controlling behavior because everything is strategy and behavior. And you've got to have not just the strategy, you've got to have the behavioral systems in place. Like telling people, or advising people to queue. Very difficult to tell people to queue when they're used to jumping queue.
Okay. Dr. Brian, we have tried, as I've said, I have mentioned, we have tried a kind of leadership that is more or less benign, knows how to whip, and very strict and very, very stringent with regards to implementations of the country's policies. And yet, look at what we are having now. So it's still back to square one, something like that.
In some areas, if you study carefully, in some areas, without sounding theoretical, just the practicalities of how the pandemic is being managed, because this is 19, but there are so many variants now. We could be, and not to scare your viewers, your viewers, we don't know if the next one is going to be from something else. You know, the problem with African swine flu, for example, has been a challenge for corporations, not only in Visayas but mostly in Mindanao. You know, you've got all this poisoning in the sea has been a problem for the fishermen in Mindanao also.
Yes.
You know, and it's endless. And now they say that, you know, the mosquitoes, the new variant of mosquitoes is come back. And then it could be Ebola or it could be whatever. But the reality is we're not prepared. We're excellent in the Philippines at just in time or last minute. And that's not a strategy. Last minute is not a strategy. It's a reaction, not a response. But the reality is we're not prepared.
Are we not prepared?
We're not prepared.
Okay.
In my opinion.
Okay.
Of course, this is just one person's opinion, not the opinion of a university. It's just my own personal, professional observation. We are not prepared.
What would have been the good preparation when it comes to this kind of facing this kind of unseen enemy?
Well,
this kind of problem.
The preparation is you really have to have teeth for the DOH, supported by the governors, the mayor, the barangay captains, etc., and of course the Malacanang. You've got to have very, very tight support.
Okay.
But in fact, when we talk about enforcement here in the Philippines, it's almost like a negotiation. But actually, it should be strict discipline, not a negotiation. And that's a result of the culture and the styles of leadership of the leaders we have in the country. I apologize if I sound rude because I'm merely a guest of your wonderful country.
Yeah, but it has been implemented. Malacanang is doing that kind of implementation.
Have you been vaccinated?
No, not yet.
Oh, exactly. That's my point.
I see.
Why haven't you been vaccinated?
Well,
so what
due to lack of
right, but human behavior will tell you that those who have the ability to influence will be on several lists. But if you ask any of those corporations or agencies, when will I be vaccinated specifically, they can't tell you. And then there's difficulty. You've got to register, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. Look at other countries, you just run down to the pharmacy store, you show your driver's license and you're vaccinated. There's ease of use, and that's what I mean by behavior.
No, I see.
There's so many roadblocks. Okay, there's so many agencies making work and not delivering the vaccine. Of course, how can you get herd immunity, whether you believe in herd immunity or not? How can you even support it? And then, of course, you have another faction that says, oh, you know, you're going to grow 3 eyes if you get vaccine. And then there's the positive and negatives of each of the vaccines. What's your preference for vaccine? You know, are you going to take China back?
Okay, Dr. Brian, as a strategist, as a profession more of a leadership, how do we get rid of this layer of intervention?
It's difficult.
It's just a bureaucracy that is propelling us or moving us forward.
The case that we look to for where you have countries, and I trust me and believe me when I say I love this country, but the possibility exists for the Philippines to end up like India. We have many similarities with India, very similarities. But look how they're suffering now. They're really, not just because of COVID, because of the bureaucracy, because of corruption, because of all of these things. The focus on public administration, on building empires within the government.
Okay. So that's the roadblock.
These are all roadblocks,
okay.
Correct. And that's why I think there was a lot of enthusiasm for President Duterte. Of course, I can't speak for him, but of course, at the outset, it was an iron fist. And where you have this kind of culture, you need an iron fist. You cannot come in and it's not, it's not America. You can't come in and negotiate and everything is negotiable. And
okay.
You have to really be decisive and take fast action. It's speed.
Now, okay, with the involvement of the church, do you think this is also a roadblock, Dr. Brian?
I think it's fair to share with you that I'm involved in a couple of projects with the diocese.
Okay.
On feeding
Yeah.
and so on and so
Yeah,
forth.
under the Simply Care Foundation.
That's right.
Okay.
But also not just as a companion to Simply Share Foundation. For example, we have a project that where I recognized, and many have recognized for a long time, that children here have no slippers, but they're developing foot diseases.
Okay.
And they can't travel. So I have
yeah.
a program that builds on last year's program, which is this year I'll bring in 10,000 slippers for the children. But the diocese is the partner, not in terms of funding, but in terms of distribution, because I don't want those slippers hijacked.
Okay, okay.
So of course there's this project, and we're rolling out a project on it's like the gifting box through Simply that you talked to Pam about, but it's a program that it's like a food pantry, which there are many sprouting up.
Yeah.
Many sprouting up in the country.
I think the program and the foundation of your wife, Pam, is she is the precursor of the community pantry.
Yes.
And you as a corporate global strategist, from financial strategist to philanthropist.
Yes, well, we all do our little piece while we're here. That's all we can do. We just all...
You do a lot to our countrymen, Dr. Professor Brian.
Well, but I mean, that's our purpose. Our purpose is to contribute while we're here because, you know, the casualty rate is so high. We're not in control of... we might pretend to believe that we can manage, but actually we're not managing.
Okay.
We can't even manage how many beds there are. I mean, we could put up this site, that tent, and do whatever, but it's not managing. It's reacting. We're reacting.
Dr. Brian, if not for the pandemic, where are you now?
Oh, I would be somewhere around the world trying to provide quality strategic services, either in the profit sector or the non-profit or in the military sector.
Okay. Now, here in the city, here in Cebu or in this part of the country, you have been coaching and having a sort of a guidance to a lot of corporate leaders or businesses in the country.
I've been essentially trying to help. I mean, helping is not necessary. Well, I mean, of course, it's the corporate sector, but it's not necessary to generate revenue. It's really to help create jobs, create wealth for shareholders. It's really, without sounding trite, it's really about creating opportunity that otherwise these companies may not have the opportunity to access resources globally in this particular. I mean, there aren't many in the world who have a solid track record in really growing corporations.
Okay.
And growing corporations means creating employment, creating opportunity.
Okay, that's good. Okay, that's very, very good. Okay, from the standpoint of a labor sector, tomorrow is a Labor Day. Millions of workers are displaced by the COVID-19 pandemic. The economic growth rate in the region or in the country does not trickle down to the greater majority. To the workers, I mean, which is considered as the frontline economic frontliners. So how do you assess and how do you build the gap as strategies for them to go back to their previous work in order to lessen the unemployment problem in the country?
Well, you're very experienced, and you've interviewed and probably interrogated many, but it's really but it's really like this. One of the pillars of economic development is to really redesign your foreign direct investment strategy.
Okay.
And
Good.
that needs work.
Okay.
This is not just sitting around, listening to the wonderful geniuses at UP, which is classic.
Yeah.
We typically do that. We listen to ADB, classic. All very respectful, all very nice. But why don't we sit and listen carefully to those who are in the world actually creating thousands and millions of opportunities. I mean, for example, is a wonderful example of how it is that at one point in time, not that long ago, where India controlled the business outsourcing business, and that all of that mostly came to the Philippines, and now Philippines are really the king.
Right.
But we need to do that not with the business outsourcing companies. We need to do that in technology, because when you go around like I do, and you meet with professionals and you meet with corporate leaders with technology companies, many of the geniuses in those companies in America and Europe are actually Filipino.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
So why are those opportunities not available here? And the answer cannot just be the answer cannot just be its amount of compensation.
All right.
It cannot be.
Right.
That's lame.
I
Very
agree.
lame.
Yeah.
It cannot
Okay.
be.
Yes. So much for that, and we have a lot of discussion with our valuable guest this evening, a professor and a doctor at the same time, a doctor of philosophy, Professor Dr. Brian Tu. After these reminders, don't go away. Once again, good evening. Welcome to our weekly show, My Politics. This is your host, Art Barrett. Our guest this evening is our valuable guest, Dr. Professor Brian Tu, a global corporate strategist. Okay. Doc Brian, I understand that you, over the last 10 years, you have assisted several Filipinos in assessing some of the top universities in the world. Can you say something about this?
Yes, I'm happy to share. Whenever you teach globally, one of the things that you notice in leading programs at leading schools, there's an absence of Filipinos. And you ask the question, why? So you ask the administration and the faculty, and they say, well, it's because they don't qualify. But qualifying financially is not the same thing as qualifying academically.
Okay.
And it turns out that because the results of my work, pro bono work at various universities here in the Philippines and my teaching, that I've come into a lot of contact of candidates who really are deserving, in my own opinion.
Okay.
Not because of my own bias or my involvement in the country. And so I decided a number of years ago to develop a coaching program for gifted students in the Philippines who wanted to access leading schools. And I've done that for about 10 years.
Okay.
And I'm happy to share with you, and nothing arrogant, just the facts only, that so far it's been 100% of the ones that I've been able to coach. They've all accessed the leading schools around the world.
Okay. What are these institutions? What are these universities?
The Harvards of the
Dr. Brian?
world, the Yales of the world,
Okay.
the Stanfords of the world, their London School of Economics, and HSA Paris, for example. And schools even in Asia, Hong Kong U, Hong Kong Poly, SMU in Singapore.
Okay.
And then they're doing very well. And many are still in touch with me, and they share with me how they're doing.
Really?
And they've gone on to wonderful, wonderful things. I mean, and that's the one thing it's so impressive, is that they seem to do so well overseas.
I see.
But here they were just average students, or mostly they were underestimated.
Until now, are they still continuing that kind of coaching, that kind of approach that you are in?
Yeah, well, I can only coach so many per year, but many do stay in touch, and I'm currently coaching some. I mean, this last round for coaching the candidates who are entering the September, that I'm still coaching them, but actually they're ready, and they've been accepted already.
I see.
So that, they're making the usual arrangements for accommodations and travel and so on and so forth.
Okay.
But what I can share with you is this. If there was one student who is really my most outstanding student, happens to be Filipino. Now, this is globally, This is not my top French student or my top British student or top American student. Happens to be Filipino, who actually followed half of the schools that I went to, and is now a director at NASA.
Oh, wow.
Went to Carnegie Mellon, or went to Harvard, and went to the UK as well, doing exceptionally well.
Okay.
So they all, without exception, seem to do so well overseas. And that applies to professionals as well.
I see. I thought, Dr. Brian, you are only involved with two world internationally or internationally known institutions, the HEC in Paris
Yes.
and the Wharton University of Pennsylvania.
Yes, correct. They actually.
But you are also involved in Harvard?
Well, what I also went to Harvard, so I'm
Okay.
involved with Harvard,
Okay.
but and many other schools. I mean, where you have relationship, okay, that's where you can help, or because you can give deep insights how to access top schools. Okay, and that's the advantage I have is that I come from those schools. I've taught at some of those schools. I've been in administration in some of those schools, and I have close connections. And so, but it's not like what happened last year with the where you have to pretend that you're an athlete or something like that. And we all went to jail. It's nothing like that. It's legitimate. It's legitimate in a sense that it's knowing how to prepare, what internships you need, and how to really prepare your application, and how to coach, and not just sitting at home during the summers. Do some real volunteer work, do some community work, get some real experience, and that means not doing it in your father's company or your family organization, because that's the obvious thing to do.
I see. Okay, Dr. Brian, as of last count, I've seen a leading business magazine in Hong Kong that you were the cover page, the cover story.
Yes.
So at least in Hong Kong, you were recognized.
Yes, well, in a number of countries, I'm very blessed to somehow, for some reason, be blessed enough to attract media cover stories, because each of those cover stories has been a case study behind each one of those.
I see.
So I've obviously achieved something in each of these areas.
I see. So is that the reason why you're?
That's the reason why. I'm not actively
you're the cover
seeking.
story of that particular business magazine.
Right.
So here in the Philippines, have you discovered already?
Well,
about you?
Well, there's one cover that came out a number of years ago, which is the Health and Leisure magazine, and there was a cover, not a cover story, but an article, a good article written about the work, not about me, the work, called I think it's called the Red Dragon or something like that. Very nice, very nice.
Okay.
Yeah, there's lots. I mean, the media is always interested in success stories.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
so if you go around the world like I do and achieve something, of course the media will follow because you have a track record. And the responsibility, I mean, at first I said, no, I'm not interested in PR or media coverage. But in fact, I was given a lecture on the importance of media to share the story so others can benefit from your wisdom or your know-how or your strategy. And then I started to change myself. I started to think, that's important. As an educator, I should share.
Okay.
And so that's
great.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay. Dr. Brian, you have been here for the last 15 years or so.
Visiting.
Yes. So you made a lot of contacts already with the country's top hunsus of the corporation. Okay.
I've had the privilege of meeting some.
Okay.
Yes.
So you still have also some contact with your friends in Malacanang nowadays?
Well, and Malacanang are not really interested in foreigners. And we're not allowed, foreigners are not allowed to be involved in campaign elections and so on and so on and so on.
But they are your friends.
Well, I think it's fair to say that my relationships should be viewed as being very positive because I've never asked for anything.
Okay.
And that part I'm not interested in. This is not, I'll strategize for you if you give me this. My golden rule is, if you're really prepared to help, then help. Don't ask.
Okay.
Okay. But of course, if they buy you coffee, of course you have to be respectful. Yeah.
Okay, that's it.
Well, normally they invite you for coffee or they invite you to eat lechon.
Yeah.
So, and I'm already overweight, so I try to stay away from the lechon.
Okay, that's great. Okay, Dr. Brian, you have been also involved in helping the armed forces of the Philippines over the last 15 years. Are you able to share some of your activities, which I understand all are pro bono?
Yes. Without exception, all of my work with the Armed Forces of the Philippines, whether it's teaching strategy and leadership in Baguio at PMA, or teaching at NETC in Zambales, San Antonio, or teaching at Navy headquarters, or teaching in Cavite, or teaching even in Cebu, I will not accept a centavo for my work with the military, because either your heart's in it, or you know, you don't do these kinds of things to make money for yourself. You know, unfortunately, I don't think the Armed Forces of the Philippines has access to some of my colleagues. And so what I've done is I've tried to show some leadership by inviting them to help the Armed Forces of the Philippines, by inviting them as co-professors to give seminars and so on and so forth. Because at present, where you have a large military force, how do you so many benefit, you know, from the level of the quality of education, where you can only send 1 or 2 or 3 per year to these wonderful institutions around the world? And the way to do that is to reverse it. Bring the faculty to the Philippines. And not accept compensation, and the acceptance is very fast with the military, not with other government agencies. I'm sorry.
So you've been involved in a lot of branches of the Armed Forces of the Philippines?
Well, in those areas that I've mentioned, but I make a golden rule of having the Navy, who's always the host, to invite other branches. You know, the Air Force, the PNP even, you know, to invite, and so that others can benefit. So
I think all your students now are generals already.
Yes.
A lot of them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they are. And I was fortunate a number of years ago to be adopted by the PMA class of '82. And that's reward enough. In fact.
Who is the leader? Who is the head of class 82?
I have no idea who class is now. I mean, but the sponsor, those who sponsored me, have just retired. I mean, they were, you know, last year's and the previous year's leaders in those particular areas. But who's the class, the leader now? I have no idea.
Okay. Are you a reservist, Dr. Brian?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a privilege to be a reservist. But do I have rank? The answer is yes. But it's honorary rank.
Oh, exactly.
You know,
yes.
Unfortunately, I'm not a Filipino citizen. I can only do so much. But you know, the greatest gift we have, Art, as you well know, okay, is the gift of oneself. And so we should all be prepared to give of ourselves if we can.
Exactly, yes. Okay. And how did you come up with this kind of program, entering and coaching and offering yourself to the Armed Forces of the Philippines?
Well, it was by coincidence. I had met a Commodore at that time, long time ago. I was introduced, and over a coffee, one conversation led to another, and that particular Commodore at that time said, "Hey, why don't you come and visit with us and say a few words and share a little bit of your knowledge?" It's very gracious, very respectful, as almost all interactions in the Philippines are. Very gracious.
Okay. What year was that?
Oh, that was, all I know is about 15, 17 years ago, something like that.
Okay.
Just below 20 years.
Okay. Now, is that part of the regular program of the PMA that you are having this kind of discussion with the military or the students?
In the Navy it is.
Okay.
Not necessarily PMA, but I have taught PMA.
I see. Yeah. Dr. Professor Brian, can you tell a little bit about your background? Why is it that you're visiting this country, and what's your purpose, and what's your plans and programs for yourself, no? For our televiewers?
Well, thank you so much for that question. It's a very kind invitation. Like most, if I can presume, like most Filipinos, I come from a very strong, humble, indigent background. I came from a very poor family, and I was fortunate to go to college early, and one conversation led to another. I think the reason I've been able to move around from university to university over the years, both as a student and as a professor, is simply because the professors really wanted to get rid of me, because I would ask questions and so on and so forth. But in any event, I was lucky, and I've been blessed to go to some of the leading schools in the world. And so it's each one has been a blessing. I've learned so much. I'm a strong advocate of lifelong learning. And my only way I know how to give back is through charity work. I've been involved in raising money in Manila for PGH, the Sagip Buhay Foundation. I spent 3 years doing that. Now I'm happy to help Pamela with her foundation, and happy to help the diocese, and so on and so forth. All I know is we just do what we can do, and without, of course this is not a homily, but all I can say is, if God has given you gifts, you better use them. It's as simple as that. But thank you for asking that question.
So that's a homiletics, not a
Homiletic.
homily. Homily and politics.
I've never heard that term. Thank you for teaching that to me.
Okay, so, and from that on, you still continuing it.
Yes.
You still love it.
Yes. Well, I think it's fair to say that I have a very deep personal paradigm also, and that is, I've worked in a lot of different countries around the world, but not just visiting, but a lot of different, for a period of time,
Okay.
several years.
Okay.
But I have never in my life so far seen a country like the Philippines anywhere. And I've worked in China, I've worked in here, there, and everywhere. I've never seen a country that has so many wonderful contribers, people, citizens, but so underestimated and not given opportunity. I've never seen anywhere like the Philippines, where they do, as I mentioned earlier, do so well in other countries, but here they're managed, they're suppressed, in fact. And so I've chosen to do the little I can for the days and the months I'm here. Every year, I believe that our job, those of us who can create opportunity for Filipinos, and of course not just Filipinos, everybody else as well, regardless of what country we're in, to do the very best we can, particularly the young people.
You mean to say, Dr. Brian, we have a lot of talent here in this country?
Wonderful talent, unbelievable, and it's what I call the country that has the untapped wealth of knowledge and resources. I mean, you won't find another culture that I've never seen anyway, another culture that is not on.
Okay. You go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah.
You go ahead. You go ahead.
That I've never seen a country where there's a lack of opportunity, but so many talented young people.
Okay. My dear viewers, the wisdom and the words, the statement coming from our guest, Professor Dr. Brian too, is a very positive one. Okay, for our youngsters, for the Philippines. Guest, my dear televiewers, we don't have enough time with our invited guest this evening, Professor Dr. Brian too. This is your host, Art Barrett. Manamilit lang moingon, nga samtang muhingos pang ilong sa tao. Iyang mga pangandoy ug tingusbawan, way katapusan. Daghang salamat. Good evening. Bye-bye.